In just 2 rounds, one man changed the history of boxing forever, and the entire world couldn't believe what they were seeing. It was February 25, 1964. The world was accustomed to seeing champions who seemed invincible, giants with iron fists, men who instilled fear even before the first punch was thrown, and among them, Sonny Liston reigned supreme, nicknamed the Beast. Liston was feared not only for his brute strength but also for his intimidating gaze that froze any opponent. Few dared to truly face him, and those who did were swallowed up by his suffocating presence. But that night, in Miami, something unexpected would happen. Before him stood a young man of just 22 years old, loud-mouthed, brimming with confidence, whom many believed to be nothing more than a media clown, Cassius Clay. Clay wasn't seen as a real threat. The newspapers were betting he wouldn't last more than a few rounds. Experts said the kid talked more than he fought, and public opinion, it had already chosen its side. Liston would win. Clay wasn't the favorite. He didn't have the media's respect, nor the fans' fear. But he had something no one noticed, an almost supernatural conviction that the impossible was about to happen. The atmosphere that night was one of tense anticipation. The gym was packed, bets were flying like wildfire, and the crowd was thrilled with the certainty of witnessing another swift execution by Sonny Liston. Clay, however, showed no fear. Before the fight, he shouted phrases that many dismissed as the ravings of an arrogant young man. "I'm the greatest. I'm going to shock the world." What seemed like bravado hid genuine confidence. Clay believed what he said, and that belief would be put to the test before the eyes of millions. That night, the fight wouldn't just be physical. It was much more than punches. It was the clash between tradition and daring, between the beast and the boy, between fear and unshakable faith. The ring in Miami would become the stage for one of the greatest moments in the history of the sport, when a daring young man decided to defy logic and prove that courage can bring down giants. The bell echoed through the gym, like a shot signaling the beginning of something historic. Cassius Clay leaped from the bench with the lightness of a dancer, his feet barely touching the floor, while Sonny Liston advanced like a bull, heavy, slow, but carrying a fury contained in every muscle. The contrast was brutal. On one side, the invincible champion, hard as stone, with broad shoulders and fists like stone. On the other, a smiling boy, moving with a speed that resembled choreography more than a fight. Clay shouted inside the ring, taunting, uttering phrases that echoed through the astonished audience. "You can't catch me, son. Your hands are too slow." With each dodge, the crowd reacted with surprise. Liston threw powerful hooks, crosses that could knock out any man, but the young man dodged them with his head held high, his body light, as if playing. Clay's eyes shone with something no one expected to see. There was no fear, there was confidence. It was as if he were dancing in the ring, floating with an elegance that left Liston confused and infuriated. "Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee," he said before the fight. And now, before the entire world, he proved that this wasn't just poetry, it was reality. The first few seconds were enough to turn anticipation into tension. The crowd, which had entered believing Liston would win quickly, began to ask, "What's going on here?" With each failed attack from the champion, the expression on his face hardened. He wasn't used to chasing. It was always the opposite. His opponents retreated, feared, and fell. But Clay approached, looked them in the eye, laughed, and challenged. "Come on, champ. Is that all you've got?" he shouted mid-fight, oblivious to the fury he aroused. Liston, irritated, increased the force of his punches. But the more he tried to land, the more Clay evaded them. He didn't stand still. His footwork was a spectacle in itself. Quick lateral shifts, light leaps, spins that left the champion punching the wind. It was a style never before seen in heavyweight boxing, a dangerous dance that transformed the ring into a stage. Clay wasn't just fighting Liston, he was fighting against the logic of boxing, against the idea that a heavyweight should be static and brutal. By the end of the first round, Clay had accomplished the improbable. Not only had he survived, but he had made it clear he wasn't afraid. The crowd groaned, the reporters exchanged incredulous looks, and Liston's coaches were beginning to realize this fight wouldn't be like their others. The kid they called the loudmouth, the big mouth from Louisville, had weathered the initial storm and emerged unscathed. When he returned to his bench, Clay wasn't panting. On the contrary, he was laughing and shouting to the audience, "I told you. You'll see. I'm going to shock the world." Across the way, Liston sat with a heavy gaze, breathing deeply, his eyes fixed on the young man who dared to face him fearlessly. The champion seemed more furious than confident. For the first time in years, someone was not only resisting him, but actually ridiculing him in public. The entire gym, in that moment, understood. This fight wouldn't just be about punches. It was about courage versus fear, youth versus experience, boldness versus brutality. Cassius Clay wasn't here to survive, he was here to challenge an empire. And as the bell announced the start of the second round, a silent truth hung in the air. The impossible was just beginning to happen. The second round began like a thunderclap. Sonny Liston emerged from his stool, his face tense, his neck muscles bulging, his breathing heavy. His eyes were filled with pure hatred. He was determined to end this travesty as quickly as possible. But Clay, instead of backing down, advanced with even more boldness. With every step, he taunted. With every dodge, he smiled. He moved with a speed that seemed impossible for a heavyweight. The crowd didn't know whether to applaud or fall silent in the face of such audacity. It was like watching a boy play with fire, facing a monster. Liston threw a brutal right hand, aiming for Clay's head. The impact of that punch, had it landed, could have decided the fight, but Clay leaned in at the last moment, and the champion's fist grazed it, finding only emptiness. The crowd reacted with a gasp of surprise. Clay didn't just dodge, he responded. A quick, sharp, accurate jab, right to Liston's face. The champion took a step back. It was the first time the world had seen Sonny Liston take a step back. The impossible, once again, happened before everyone's eyes. The ring transformed into a stage for psychological warfare. Clay wasn't just fighting with his fists, but with his mind. Every word he uttered in the ring was a knife to his opponent's confidence. "Are you tired, Sonny?" he shouted. "Is that all you've got?" The crowd, initially incredulous, began to laugh, began to cheer along, began to believe. The overwhelming favorite no longer seemed so invincible. While Liston attacked with heavy blows, Clay responded with a series of jabs. Quick, sharp, like poisoned needles. They weren't punches meant to knock out, but to wound pride, to inflict damage slowly. Each jab that landed on Liston's face drew reactions from the crowd, and each expression of frustration on the champion's face signaled the fight was changing course. Clay was a maestro, directing the chaos with his light movements, while a furious Liston seemed increasingly lost. And then came the moment that made the entire gym hold its breath. Clay landed a perfect sequence, 3 jabs in a row to Liston's face, and finished with a straight right that sent him stumbling backward. The champion swayed. The seemingly indestructible beast faltered before millions of eyes. The crowd erupted. Journalists pounded their typewriters furiously, trying to capture every second. The radio broadcast went crazy. The improbable was happening. Liston, embarrassed, tried to hide his instability by returning to the attack with even more anger, but each wasted punch weighed on his arms, draining his energy. Clay, on the other hand, seemed increasingly lighter, faster, more confident. His shouts could be heard even in the back rows. "I told you I'd shock the world." The ring was his. The fight was no longer just about the belt. It was about pride, about the history being written before everyone's eyes. And in that moment, amidst the roar of the crowd and the champion's fury, it became clear Sonny Liston wasn't ready for this. Clay wasn't a playful kid. He was a prophet inside the ring. Before the third round began, Clay looked at the camera, at the audience, at the entire world that doubted him, and launched into another of his phrases. "You ain't seen nothing yet." If you're following this historic fight, like it now, subscribe to the channel, and comment, would you have believed this kid in the crowd? Your participation is what keeps us bringing you stories like this. And so, amidst applause and boos, the impossible continued to grow. But what would happen in the next round would forever seal the night. Cassius Clay stopped being just a name, and began to become a legend. By the time the third round began, the silence in the gym was gone. The entire audience rose from their seats, divided between disbelief and euphoria. With each of Clay's movements, a wave of screams echoed, as if the dance inside the ring were a spectacle never before seen. Sonny Liston, once considered the most feared man on the planet, no longer looked the same. Sweat dripped down his forehead, his eyes filled with frustration, and his breathing became heavier. Clay, on the other hand, seemed rejuvenated, as if every minute in the ring fueled his energy. Liston tried to regain control, advancing with powerful blows, hooks that seemed capable of taking off any man's head. But Clay remained untouchable. He dodged with his light body, spinning as if he were part of the wind. With each punch that flew by, the champion lost more than strength. He lost confidence. Clay sensed this and didn't let it slip. "Are you tired, Sonny? You're too slow," he shouted between dodges, trying to further humiliate and distract his opponent. The crowd, which had previously doubted the young man, was now beginning to lean in his favor. Chants of Clay, Clay, echoed along with the taunts he launched from inside the ring. It was as if the impossible was taking shape. and everyone who had previously bet on the young man's swift downfall was now forced to reconsider their beliefs. Sonny Liston, the man no one dared challenge, was being dominated by a 22-year-old. But the fight wasn't all brilliance. Midway through the round, something happened that could have changed the entire story. Clay began blinking strangely. He rubbed his eyes with his gloves, showing discomfort. A rumor spread through the gym. Something had gotten into his eyes. Some still believe it was Vasily, purposely put on Liston's fists to blind his opponent. The fact is, Clay, for a few moments, could barely see. He shook his head, trying to keep his distance, and for the first time that night, the audience noticed a weakness in the young man who seemed indestructible. Liston, sensing this, advanced like a predator. This was the chance he needed. His blows began to land on Clay's body, hard punches that finally found their mark. The crowd held their breath. Was this the end of his daring? Clay staggered, but even nearly blind, he didn't flinch. He used his legs to keep his distance, ran around the ring, taunting even without his vision. "You're not going to catch me, Sonny," he shouted, even as he groped the space around him. It was more than physical resistance, it was pride, it was ego. It was an unshakable belief that he would not be defeated. The round was a battle of survival. Clay defended himself as best he could, running in circles, using his instincts to avoid the worst. Liston was hitting with everything he could, but even with the opportunity open, he couldn't take the young man down. When the bell rang, Clay returned to his bench, his face tense, rubbing his eyes in despair. "I can't see," he shouted to his team. The stunned crowd began to murmur. The boy who had enchanted the world seemed on the verge of collapse, but there was something inside Clay that wouldn't let him give up. Even nearly blind, he wouldn't give up. He screamed furiously, "Clean my eyes. I won't stop, I won't bow." And it was in that moment, faced with the real possibility of defeat, that the legend truly began to be born. Because it wasn't just skill that was at stake, but the soul of someone who wouldn't accept defeat. When the bell sounded for the next round, Clay stood up, his eyes still burning, but with the same conviction as ever. Liston had the strength, but Clay had something the whole world was beginning to see. The insane courage of someone who believed he was greater than any obstacle. And in that moment, it was clear to everyone, even if he were defeated, Clay would never be forgotten, because he was already making the impossible a reality. In the next round, the fate of the fight would begin to change completely. The fourth round began with a charged atmosphere, as if everyone in the gym knew something bigger than a fight was about to happen. Cassius Clay, still with his eyes sore, rose from the bench like a man possessed, determined not to let this obstacle bring him down. His team had done everything they could to clear his vision, and little by little, clarity was returning. On the other side, Sonny Liston advanced confidently, believing the young man was already weakened. But what Liston didn't know was that, amidst the momentary darkness, Clay had found something no opponent could take from him. The certainty that he was the chosen one for this moment. Clay's movement became a spectacle once again. His legs, light as wings, danced around the ring in a steady rhythm, dodging Liston's furious attacks. And it wasn't just defense, it was a relentless counterattack. His jabs began to find the champion's face repeatedly. They were sharp, lightning-fast snaps that made Liston's head snap back. The crowd roared with each blow, unable to believe what they were seeing. The invincible was being hit, and he couldn't react with the same brutality as before. Liston tried to use his immense strength, but his movements became increasingly sluggish. The heavy muscles that had once been weapons now felt like chains, dragging him down. Clay, on the other hand, was lighter than ever. Sweat was pouring down his body, but his face wore a defiant smile. "You can't beat me, Sonny," he shouted, even as he unleashed another barrage of jabs. It was a scene bordering on humiliation. The kid, everyone called the loudmouth, was dismantling the world's most feared champion piece by piece. Each minute felt like an eternity. The frustration etched on Liston's face showed that he was no longer in control of the fight. He threw desperate blows, but found only air, while Clay moved like an untouchable ghost. The crowd, which had initially feared the young man's boldness, was now on its feet, chanting his name as if they already knew they were witnessing history. It was impossible not to feel that something extraordinary was unfolding before their eyes. The round wore on, and Clay seemed to gain strength with each passing second. His fists lacked Liston's devastating weight, but their precision was ruthless. Each jab left marks on the champion's face. Each straight right drew expressions of pain and rage. And with each blow, the legend grew. Clay was no longer just a challenger. He was becoming a symbol of courage, of boldness, of rebellion against the fate written by experts and oddsmakers. At the end of the round, When the bell rang, the image spoke for itself. Liston sat exhausted on the bench, his shoulders heavy, breathing heavily. Clay, meanwhile, paced the ring with his arms raised, shouting for all to hear, "I told you, I'm the greatest." It wasn't just provocation, it was a prophecy being fulfilled in front of millions. And in that instant, a certainty spread throughout the gym and the world. Sonny Liston, the feared monster, was falling, not on the floor yet, but in the imagination. His aura of invincibility was shattering. The kid from Louisville wasn't just surviving, he was dominating. What would come next wouldn't just be the end of a fight. It would be the birth of a legend that would forever change boxing, culture, and the very idea of the impossible. Because Clay wasn't just beating a champion, he was defying the logic of the entire world. And in the next chapter, what everyone thought was improbable would become definitive. The moment when the impossible would cease to be a dream and become reality before incredulous eyes. The fifth round began with the tension of a legendary battle. Cassius Clay was no longer just the challenger. He had become a living spectacle in the ring. His feet moved in circles, light, almost invisible with speed. His arms launched accurate jabs, like arrows shot by an archer in the midst of battle. On the other side, Sonny Liston walked heavily, his breath growing shallow, his body scarred by the repetitive blows that struck his face, his shoulders, his confidence. The invincible champion seemed increasingly smaller, and this was more shocking than any punch. The audience was ecstatic. Some screamed as if witnessing a miracle, others watched in absolute silence, trying to comprehend how this 22-year-old, who until just a few hours ago had been treated as a joke, was turning the impossible into reality. Journalists looked at each other in disbelief. Radio announcers struggled to find words to describe the scene. Clay was dismantling Liston with speed, precision, and, above all, courage. Every provocation the young man hurled echoed not only inside the gym but throughout the watching world. Midway through the round, Clay landed a perfect combination. 2 swift jabs followed by a clean right hand that landed squarely in Liston's face. The champion swayed, stumbled, and for a moment time seemed to stand still. The crowd erupted in cheers, believing the end was near. But Clay took his time. He wasn't looking for just any old knockout. He wanted to humiliate the legend, to dismantle him blow by blow, to show everyone that it wasn't luck, but destiny. Liston tried to respond, but each punch he threw was slower, more predictable. He was like a wounded, ferocious animal, still dangerous, but no longer as intimidating as before. Clay sensed this, and his smile widened. "You can't take me, Sonny. I'm the greatest," he shouted between blows, making the crowd roar like never before. The ring was no longer just a sports arena, that was an altar where a new legend was being born. At the end of the round, Liston staggered back to his bench. His heavy body seemed unable to bear the weight of the approaching defeat. The doctors watched intently, the trainers tried to motivate him, but the truth was clear in his eyes. He no longer wanted to be there. The beast had lost his soul. Clay, on the other hand, paced the ring with his arms raised, shouting for the world to hear, "Look at me. I'm going to shock the world." And that's exactly what happened. As the 6th round approached, Liston made the decision that would forever change history. He didn't return. The undefeated champion, the most feared man on the planet, had given up. For the first time in years, the Iron Legend shattered before everyone's eyes. Cassius Clay, the discredited kid, the loudmouth no one took seriously, had become heavyweight champion of the world. The reaction was instantaneous. The gym erupted in screams, applause, tears, and disbelief. The impossible had happened. Clay ran around the ring, jumping, shouting, as if he were bigger than the world. "I'm the greatest. I told you. I'm the greatest." That night wasn't just a sporting victory, it was a cultural earthquake. Boxing would never be the same again, and neither would the world. Cassius Clay didn't just win a fight. He overcame disbelief, overcame fear, overcame logic, and in that instant, in front of millions of people, a boy became a legend, paving the way for something even greater. Because from that moment on, Clay was no longer just Cassius Clay. He was about to become Muhammad Ali, the man who would forever change the history of sports and the way the world viewed courage. The world was in shock, and, more than ever, it believed in the impossible.